Good morning and welcome to today's webinar, Navigating Political Discussions in the Workplace. I'm Allison DeFlorio, co-founder and managing partner of Exude Human Capital, and I'm so thrilled to have with me for today's conversation my colleague and senior consultant with Exude Human Capital, Romaine Jones-Wise. Morning, Ro.
Good morning, Allison. How are you? It's good to see you. Looking forward to today's conversation.
You know, Ro and I have had this type of conversation many times over the last year as the national and global political situations have become what they are today and tensions arise. And we thought it would be helpful to share some insights that we have learned and experiences that we have had with our clients and with the business community and with our consulting team, really, to provide some tips and best practices and perhaps address some of your questions as you prepare to navigate conversations moving forward. We did not, by the way, plan this on the eve of the vice presidential debate. That was just coincidental. And I actually realized it this morning. But in any case, this does mark, I believe, 36 days to the election and a little over 100 days to the inauguration. Regardless of the outcome, we know that there will be tension, there will be conversations, and employers have to be prepared to navigate those conversations over the next several months and then some. And for those of you that have joined us before, welcome back. And for those of you that are joining us for the first time, we want to share a couple of housekeeping tips before we get into our program. This session is being recorded, so we will send a link out after the webinar. And please feel free to share that with people you think may find it of value. And your questions are really important to us. So your phones are muted. However, we will be looking at the QA feature here. So please drop any questions you may have. Ro and I will do our best to address them throughout the webinar. If for any reason we can't, our contact information is available and you can feel free to reach out to us. We really want to hear from you and we hope that you find today's conversation of value. With that, we'll do some formal introductions about ourselves and about Exude. As I mentioned, I'm the co-founder and managing partner of Exude. And for those of you who may not be familiar with us, we are a human capital consulting firm with 3 practice areas: human resources, diversity, equity, inclusion, belongingness, and leadership development. And we always like to say that we look at these as being very interconnected and the need for these 3 practice areas to be mutually beneficial. And today's topic is a good example of that. We work with employers across all industries in helping them in all their HR pieces, including things like crafting policies or dealing with employee relations issues. You can have the most well-crafted policy. It should be crafted through the lens of inclusion and equity. But if your leaders and managers are not trained to have conversations and effectively execute against that policy, then it may not have the impact that you intended. And that's how we operate here at Exude. We really look at that integration of human resources, equity, inclusion, and leadership development. So I hope to share with you some insights that I've learned and tips that I've heard from business leaders and organizations that are doing this effectively. And I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Romaine Jones-Wise, better known as Ro or Lettuce. I've been in human resources now for over 20 years, working with Exude for the past 3.5 at the intersectionality of all of our disciplines: HR, leadership development, and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. My signature tagline is I have a mind for business and a heart for people. So I can connect with individuals, and in my professional career, I've really encountered a lot of conversations, difficult conversations, helping coach leaders in how to navigate this space. And this aligns very much with how to navigate these political discussions that we know are forthcoming or currently happening in the workplace.
So thank you, Ro. And again, thanks for being my partner on this today. So what, just our agenda, we want to talk about what you often hear, First Amendment rights. Well, we'll explain that because it's really state and local laws that govern speech in the workplace and things that you can think about when establishing company policy and boundaries to maintain a respectful workplace. We're going to talk about leadership's role in managing respectful communication and again, guidelines and conduct. And throughout the conversation and at the end of the conversation, we're going to share tips for employers on how to navigate discussions and de-escalate conversations. I think all of this said is, these conversations may be happening truly by a water cooler or at your desk, but then remember, these are also happening online in chat boxes and things like that. So we have to think a little bit more broadly and on social media. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move through our conversation today. But first, I always like to set some context for the topic. And certainly, if we think about the current landscape, it's full of tension. It's full of global tension, wars. We have the 2024 elections, which I don't think anyone on this call can wake up and make it to the coffee maker without hearing, reading, or seeing something about the state of the elections. We also know that there's some trepidation and fears around post-election concerns, regardless again of which party wins. And there's also been quite a bit of legislative decisions, Supreme Court decisions, things that are impacting people and that trigger emotional responses. And as we've said many times, and as all of you know, the line between work and life is really blended now. So what may trigger me emotionally, and we used to say leave it at the door, it can become challenging to kind of leave these very emotional responses at the door and they come into the workplace. So how is that impacting the workplace? Littler Mendelson did an employer survey recently in 2024, and they reported that 87% of employers are very concerned about the ability to manage divisive political and social beliefs in the workplace. Managers not feeling comfortable or confident to have conversations that they may not be used to having. We mentioned we have 36 days to go. We have 111 days till inauguration. There's another study that I found very interesting by a company called Perceptics, and they're an employee engagement platform. And they shared that while people who experience general conflict, if they experience politically affiliated conflict, are 5.6 times more likely to say that their productivity is impacted, 4.9% times their mental health is impacted, and 3.5 times their physical health impacted. So that's interesting because we all know there's conflict in the workplace, but this political conflict can touch on some of the things that are very personal to people. Race, gender, national origin, religion, sexual orientation, etc. And that can really impact people. So let's talk a little bit about what's protected in the workplace and what the employer rights are. We always hear First Amendment rights. First Amendment rights really apply to government actions. So private employers are really governed by state and local laws. And Ro shared this map that I believe is on SHRM, the SHRM website,
Sure.
Ro.
Yes.
And it's an interactive map if you're interested in looking at it yourself, but it shows the states that have different private employer speech protection statutes. And I think it's important to note that there are varying degrees, and you can see from the key here, whether they're broad protections or protections for election-related speech, et cetera. And then for those states that are gray, you still have to remember that even though they may not have specific state or local laws that impact freedom of speech, the topics involved in political conversations can get into topics that are protected by other federal laws, like Title VII, conversations that start talking about sexual orientation and gender and race and color and national origin, religion. Those may get heated and then may potentially give rise to claims of discrimination or harassment under those other statutes. So when we think about boundaries, we think about the employers have a right to craft policies that will clearly state boundaries for respectful behavior or guidelines. Employers responsible for not only stating what those guidelines are, but for managing to those guidelines and making sure that when policies are created, they are well communicated and that the management leadership team does lead by example and uphold and enforce those. So the employee's responsibility is to understand the policies and to abide by the policies, and the employer's responsibility is to craft the policies, implement the policies, and enforce the policies, and make sure, of course, people are trained on those policies. Ro, did you want to add anything to this piece?
I just think it's very important to understand that boundaries piece. Like people have, you know, the right to want to feel and convey their emotions in public settings, in the workplace, but there has to be a clear way of doing that that is not going to cause harm or have negative impact on those around us. And I think that's the balance that we want to have. We're not asking people not to say what they want to say in the workplace, but it's the way in which they do it. It's the way in which they have the conversations and engage, and kind of knowing when to stop when things get escalated, and leaders being able to hold people accountable, which is a lot of the challenge that I am seeing with a lot of my clients. It's this accountability piece. Yes, the policies are in place, people know them, they've signed off on them, but there's a challenge with keeping people accountable and enforcing them and managing to what policy dictates.
I think that's important. I also think that when we think about stating the boundaries or making the boundaries clear, that's not a one time we introduce the policy and we say, here's what it means and you have to figure it out. I think it's in this kind of environment that we're living in, we have to constantly reinforce that message through our actions and through our words and redirect behavior when we see it going, stretching beyond the boundaries.
And also giving space for employees to ask questions. A
Mhm.
lot of times we implement these policies, we do the training, but we don't take the time to let people process it and make sure that their interpretation of what the policy state matches the expectations that we have. Because sometimes if a policy is vague, it leans to people making their own interpretation of what that actually means. And sometimes that can cause a little bit more harm than good. So adhering to company policies, making sure the key here is making sure that there is an outline policy that speaks to any type of topics, be it political conversations, religious conversations, anything that might be um, divisive, like things that may separate us, and making sure that there are clear guidelines around what conduct looks like, how to maintain respectful, ensuring that staff understand what behaviors are acceptable and unacceptable in terms of how they're going to engage in conversations at the baseline in general, just the way we interact with each other. But when we add on the components of such topics as politics and religion and anything else that is of a protected class, we really want to make sure that there is clear differences in how we are expecting behaviors to be modified to comply with this policy. It's really about making sure the policy is communicated effectively, which means there need to be multiple methods of communication. It cannot just be in writing, because we understand that people process information differently. So having a policy that is drafted in a way that can be read through immersive readers for people who process better hearing information, even having, small blurbs on your intranet, be it a video, just here's the highlight, just, reiterating, making sure that it is the top of conversations at the department levels, utilizing, department meetings to highlight this is the expectation going forward. Does anyone have any questions? Making sure it's constantly on the top of people's minds so they understand the importance of it. Uh, and then, of course, I am a big fan, Allison, as you know, of making sure training happens for staff and leaders. I think it is a very important concept, and sometimes we overlook it when we're implementing policy, that we don't take the time to properly train, make sure people have a clear understanding, make sure there's no holes for multiple interpretations of things, and really give people an opportunity with a clear set date of implementation so people know when the expectations are changing.
I would also say here with training, really spending time training your supervisors and managers
Mhm.
on how to respond to potential politically charged conversations. And when I say how to respond, give them language to be able to interject to stop a conversation or to mitigate a conversation in real time, or how to address a particular employee's behavior after perhaps a comment was made in a meeting. Those are the kinds of things that could be misses for employers. Sometimes we can't assume that a supervisor or manager is equipped or comfortable with having a conversation that may be uncomfortable for them. So really targeting training for supervisors and managers before you roll it to staff so that they can ask those questions that they have. Well, what if somebody says this, or what if somebody says this? How should I respond? That needs to be part of the training process so that they can effectively, lead by example and
Mhm.
be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
And a big part of this is ensuring that when we are addressing behaviors and actions, that we are specifically addressing behaviors and actions, not attacking individuals.
Mm.
So I say that to say, if you are enforcing a policy, you want to have a specific action or behavior that you've observed or that has been brought to your attention as a leader that you're calling out, and not making generalized statements about an employee and their interactions. We want to make sure we're being specific, because that's how we modify behaviors. When we give specific examples of actions, behaviors, or language that was used, then we're not making these generalized blanket statements that can be interpreted as an employee feel like they're being attacked, or they're now being chastised because of their political affiliation. It's not about the person's choice in their political affiliation. It's how they're engaging in the workforce that we want to monitor.
And I think, and we will share some sample policy language or sample policy in just a moment. But I also think when we think about company policies around guidelines, we have to also think about reviewing our social media policies.
Most
Because remember, people can say what they want on social media, on their own social media, on their own time. However, and there are protections that employers cannot look at people's social media unless there is some sort of cause.
Mhm.
And you have to be very familiar with your state and local laws around that. However, if somebody is targeted outside of work on social media, and that those two people are now in your workplace, and that is now creating an uncomfortable work environment, the employer is now on notice, and now the employer has to deal with the level of discomfort, unwelcome, or intimidating behavior that an employee is feeling in the workplace. So that's how how things can change rather quickly if you don't have clear policies. They aren't updated, they aren't, communicated effectively, and that managers don't have a good understanding of how to manage those.
Very valid point. So I think it's helpful to give sample policy language that can be utilized if you don't already have a communications policy, what you want to identify. Um, the purpose of the policy is really to ensure respectful, harmonious, and civil work environments. Meaning, and I know a lot of us hear the word civility back and forth. It's okay that we disagree. It's completely fine. It's the way that we interact. So we want to make sure that there's policy that protects not only our employees, but also anyone interacting with any of our employees. So contractors, visitors, if you have clients that you serve, this policy would be applicable to individuals. And what you want to outline are these topics here: respectful communications, what it looks like around political discussions, specifically thinking about things, people distributing political materials, campaigning, or using any other company resources. What is the parameter that the organization has around those types of actions? Is it permissible? Is it not permissible? Making that very clear so people are not, again, misinterpreting policy and taking action accordingly. What I've seen in a lot of my research and with engagements with clients recently is in their policy, they've also outlined the fact that there will be safe spaces, meaning that the company will provide designated safe spaces for open dialogues around sensitive topics, politics, religion, other things that are in the news, just a space so that people can share their thoughts. And typically, these safe spaces are moderated, facilitated by a trained moderator. That's the key. Having someone that is trained and equipped to de-escalate situations if they become heated, to make sure people adhere to the company policy around terms of engagement and how to be respectful, and then making sure that there is some type of reporting and enforcement outlined in the policy. Anonymous feedback methods are definitely recommended because some people may not feel comfortable coming forth to share their experiences, but having some type of way for them to submit information and report any violations that they may have been victim of or observed is definitely helpful.
I think something that is going to be key and critical, and Ro, I know you get involved in this frequently with regards to investigations. If you do put a policy out, in any policy that you have,
Mhm.
and you do have some sort of complaint process, that complaints are taken seriously, that they are investigated, and not every complaint needs a full-fledged investigation, but that they are listened to, and
Mhm.
that you do your due diligence as an employer to make sure that you are uh, that you understand all the facts, and that the conditions for the person, the potential claimant, that person feels safe, and that person feels respected, that we follow the process. They may not agree with the outcome of the investigation or the decision that you make, but that they know that your process has been followed. So for all of you HR people on the call today, you know that to be in a better defensible position, you want to make sure that the process that you state is the process that you actually apply. If something were to rise to the level of a formal complaint or litigation. And Ro, I know that you've been involved in a number of this type the investigations supporting clients through this over the last several months.
Mhm.
Can you share any insights just in terms of compliance with process, et cetera?
Sure, sure. What I've seen recently um, with clients, that there's the start of the investigation process, but there's no follow-up. And a lot of times employees will lose trust in the process if it's not seen all the way through. So making sure that we close those communication loops with staff is very, very important. To the degree in which you can share information, and typically because of privacy, you're not able to divulge kind of what the outcomes are or the corrective actions may be in detail, but letting staff know that we're part of the investigatory process, that this has happened, we are going to take corrective actions, although we may not be able to give full detail, but letting them know that we've gone through the entire process. Acknowledging claims, very important. Going through the investigation, being objective, and if necessary, seeking a third party to come in and do the investigation so that it doesn't skew to the side of favoritism is also something that I highly recommend. But that last component, which is what I hear a lot of when I'm engaging with clients, is that employees feel that no one ever got back to them. Nobody told me what happened. So why should I come forward and say anything the next time? And I think that's where we put ourselves in a bit of a bind, because we want employees to be accessible and have open and transparent communications with leaders. But if we as leaders and as HR professionals are not following through with that process, staff members will lose trust in the process. So we want to make sure that we are really adhering to that and seeing it all the way through from start to finish.
Great. And I think about you touched on this in balancing kind of free speech and workplace civility, but this is really core to this particular topic. Let's talk. Can you take us through this? Talk a little bit about where is that balance? We have, what I didn't share on the context slide is that Gen X is the most likely to engage in political conversations in the workplace, according to some of the recent surveys that we looked at. They are also the most likely to leave an organization if they feel that they have been targeted or discriminated against because of their political affiliation or because of their stances on certain political or on certain topics. So, Ro, talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and what that looks like in the workplace.
So in the workplace, the balancing of this is very important. And what I've seen successful is giving space for the conversations. We don't want to mute employees because that is only going to cause further tension, but we want to be able to encourage respectful dialogue with what we call a growth mindset, meaning we're not having conversation to prove a point. We're having conversations to learn about the other perspectives. And that creates a space where we can engage. And even if we disagree, if we come away with having learned something, it's beneficial for all parties. The challenge is there's this need sometimes for people to feel that they have to be right. I have to prove a point. I have to get my point across. And sometimes we engage in conversations and we listen to respond and not understand. So we want to make sure that we're encouraging respectful dialogue and creating space to have those, contentious conversations in a healthy manner. Here's the approach. I want to hear what you have to say. I may not agree, but I'm going to learn something. Maybe your perspective will open my eyes to see something differently, and maybe it won't. But I want to be mindful that I don't have to respond to say that you're wrong. That's your viewpoint. I respect it, and we move on. That's how we get workplace civility. It's not about harboring feelings or trying to hold people to a point that it becomes volatile. It's just learning. And if you don't agree, okay, we don't agree. Let's go back to the work of the company. What is the mission of the organization? How do we realign to get the work done? Because our political affiliation should not impede our ability to work together for the strategic success of the organizations for which we are employed. The role of leadership is just to lead by example, model the behaviors. And the thing I really want to stress for leaders is to remain neutral. do not play sides in this conversation. Do not pick, because what'll happen is then you'll be seen as showing favoritism because your political beliefs are similar to someone else. And that can snowball into a whole lot of other problematic incidents. It could be deemed as favorable treatment. It could be deemed as you're giving, preferential treatment or assignments or things to now individuals, which will create more of a discriminatory workplace, which is what we're trying to avoid. And then being open to conflict. Managing conflict is not as hard as we make it out to be sometimes. Conflict, the word, gets a very bad reputation. People think it is this very negative thing in the workplace, but it's not. Conflict has the potential to really help breed innovation and collaboration when managed effectively. And what's happening and what I'm seeing is with the political conversations, because people are not willing to address them or the behaviors, it is festering more conflict that is kind of cascading into other areas in the workplace. So the goal is to make sure managers are equipped to effectively handle conflict at all levels and really being able to guide conversations to help people refocus and realign and find commonality on how to move forward. What is the common ground? Where can we agree? Where can we move forward? And making sure that that is now modeled and that leaders are continuously monitoring the situations with employees that have had conflict to make sure that the relationship is mending and not further deteriorating.
Ro, I know you have worked with a lot of clients on that particular issue, on conflict in general, and
Mhm.
of course, in the context of this topic, politically charged conflict. And when I think about managers, are there some uh, are there some scenarios that would be helpful to for employers to focus on, one or two scenarios that managers may face and to do some role play in a training with managers so that they are equipped with some language or phrases to diffuse. So I think of
Mhm.
maybe a department meeting or a meeting in which I'm a manager and a political conversation starts and it gets heated and it begins to get uncomfortable. Um, in my mind, we should be training managers on how to diffuse that. And tell me if you agree or if you have some suggestions on other types of scenarios that employers could think about in advance and then maybe conduct some role playing on what do I do when this happens.
I think we also, and to your point of a comment you made earlier, we want to give consideration for what happens in our electronic communications. So what's happening in our Teams chats, what's happening on our Slack channels, what are people posting on their individual social medias or even possibly on LinkedIn that may be um that may be impacting. I was trying to find a better word for that, and I apologize for not having one. Impacting the fellow employees. So kind of getting ahead of and also helping people understand the impact of their words and their choices. It may not even be the intentions of people to do harm. They just may want to share their point of view, but the impact of how they do that or what they say, they may not understand. And there's an awareness that leaders need to be equipped with in addition to being able to de-escalate. I think if something happens in a staff meeting, you want to acknowledge people's passion for what they believe in and not minimize that, but maybe have some one-off conversations to kind of refocus. Leaders need to be able to refocus conversations to kind of parking lot, what as we call it, or table things that are not in alignment to the meeting. So being able to say, I appreciate, your enthusiasm or your passion about this topic, but we need to focus on this at hand. We can discuss this, later on in a different setting, but we need to kind of make sure we get through the objectives of this meeting today. Things like that to not minimize someone's response, but to kind of keep things leveled so that the work can be done. in the workplace.
Yeah, and I love that the way you phrase that around not minimizing the issue, but redirecting and refocusing the issue back on the meeting or the agenda or the work that needs to be done. But just to recap that, it's so important that you invest the time, and it doesn't have to be formal training. I mean, you can do that, but to just do simple scenarios of when this happens, here are some ways you can respond. I think about it particularly, really managers of at any stage of their work experience, but newer managers in particular who may not have had that experience before, or who are newly promoted managers who are having to have this conversation as a manager when they were just a few months ago having the conversation with their team members. That can be a little bit of a difficult, challenging transition.
And then also in our leadership meetings, thinking about some of the worst case scenarios. What is the worst thing that could possibly happen, and how do we get in front of that? Thinking about conversations that may arise based off of what we see in the news, what we're reading in the paper, what's coming up online, and really having some forethought so we're not always in this reactive state. Because what I've seen a lot in recent months with my clients is this leveraging of thought partnership between leaderships at that mid and senior level. Sometimes everybody's thing all on their own. That's why we have teams. This is why you have other colleagues that you can go to get other perspectives. This is what helps foster that inclusive and sense of belonging, because there's connection. Go to your fellow colleagues and say, hey, this is what I'm concerned about. What are your thoughts? Get other perspectives. So that way we're not just doing things from our own experience and implicit bias, which we all have, but we're taking into account other perspectives in our span of influence that is impactful.
Great. So you want to take us through some of these just recap of some of the tips?
Sure. So just, we stated this a lot: developing policies and communication strategies. What are the expectations of staff in the workplace? Ensuring that they are compliant with state and local laws. Best practices for initiating and guiding political conversations, making sure that people know the code of conduct, creating the safe space, having the facilitated trained moderator to kind of make sure that those conversations happen in a way that is not going to do harm or cause impact, and that they're voluntary. Like, people do not have to actively participate in those, but creating a space for those that want to have the conversation to be able to do so. Making sure that we're not alienating any specific groups as well. So we're not just giving attention to one group over the other, but we're making sure that this policies and communication strategies is inclusive of all staff, regardless of political affiliation, parties that are, probably the more known, and those that are not as well known, considering all of those. Monitoring and enforcement is going to be crucial. Keeping a pulse on what's going on with your teams, checking in with staff. Hey, how are you? Is there anything you need to discuss? Is there anything going on? How can I best support you right now? There may just be a lot of people internalizing kind of some of the strain and the strife of all that's going on in terms of the elections, with the world as we know it right now, but just kind of doing a check-in with staff and making sure that their mental well-being is intact. If there's additional resources or support that they can use, and making that accessible to them is also. And then again, training for new managers, newly promoted managers, for individuals that were colleagues 3 months ago and now are supervisors, thinking about that dynamic, and then understanding that multiple generations in the workforce are going to require managers to manage differently. I think we said it in one of our previous, people are now expected to lead and manage in a way that they've never been led or managed before. So this whole new concept of multi-generational workforces, understanding cultural awareness and sensitivity, it takes a lot to effectively manage and lead a team, but it's doable. And we want to make sure that, the training is here so that people have the necessary what we call soft skills to lead people, because it's not just about output and productivity. It's really about caring for the entire person as a part of your team, and then leading by example. Managers should be modeling the behaviors that we want to see in the workplace. How are you engaging with other leaders? How are you engaging with other staff? Are you setting an example of how we should be communicating and creating a respectful environment? We cannot expect our team to do things that we as leaders are not doing ourselves.
And I just want to underscore that, because you may be a leader having a conversation with another leader who perhaps shares same political affiliation as you do, or talking about a political topic, or having a conversation. There may be people listening, watching, observing, seeing how you handle it, seeing how a conversation you have that might get heated, if that happens, how you handle that. All eyes go to the leaders. So you have to Rose's point, really model that behavior and be very mindful about having conversations, because as you know, in the workplace, whether or not you are directly involved in a conversation or a bystander observing a conversation, the 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 impact still could be making somebody feel unwelcome or uncomfortable if the topic gets to one of the protected categories. So I think, with the goal of trying to practice civility and respect in the workplace, we have to own our role as leaders and managers in an organization and lead by example. I want to thank Michael for the comment that he posted to everybody as well, in the chat, because I think it's very relevant to what's happening, what can be happening in organizations today. So that brings us to just our quick wrap up, a couple of quick takeaways. We've hit on these a few times, but the old rule, you got to share it 3 times, 3 different ways, so that it registers. So remember that when you're training your staff. But so some of the things that Ro really hit on, promote respectful communication. Stay neutral, focus on common goals. You can always redirect to focus on common goals. You can always redirect to remind people of what your policy and guidelines are, so that you can stay on track. And you can't do that if you don't train your staff on what their responsibilities are and your managers on what their responsibilities are. And lastly, we want to leave you with a quote that we feel just kind of sums up the value of diverse perspectives in the workplace. The best ideas emerge when very different perspectives meet. So how we have and how we embrace those conversations, manage those conversations, and allow those conversations to be healthy instead of veering off into a more destructive manner is important. So on behalf of everyone at Exude Human Capital, I want to thank all of you for taking time to join us today. We'll be thinking about you and over the next 36 and 111 days, and therefore and beyond that. And I want to thank Ro for sharing your insights, as always. Always a very helpful conversation.
Always a pleasure having conversation.
And certainly, if we weren't able to address the burning question that you have, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. We will be sharing the recording, and we hope to see you on a future webinar. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.